The woman who walked into the grocery store that Tuesday afternoon didn't know she was about to lose everything she'd built. But then again, she didn't know she'd already lost it years ago, piece by piece, compromise by compromise, until what remained was a shell so polished and impressive that even she'd stopped noticing it was hollow. Her name was Catherine Mercer, and for the past 18 years, she'd been climbing, not slowly, relentlessly. From junior analyst, a position she'd taken straight out of Harvard Business School with a perfect GPA and the kind of confidence that comes from never having failed at anything, to senior strategist, and finally to VP of operations at one of the largest technology companies in the country. The kind of company that shaped how millions of people communicated, worked, and lived. The kind of company where your title meant something in rooms where important decisions were made. She had the corner office on the 42nd floor, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Windows she rarely looked out of because she was usually staring at spreadsheets or sitting in meetings or preparing presentations. She had the title that impressed people at dinner parties, the kind of title that made people's eyes widen slightly when she introduced herself. She had a salary that would have seemed impossible to her 22-year-old self, the kind of money that meant she could buy almost anything, except, as she would later discover, the one thing she actually needed. She had recognition. She'd been featured in 3 business magazines as one of the women to watch in tech. She'd been invited to speak at conferences. She'd been part of the leadership team that had navigated the company through a major restructuring, a restructuring that had been brutal. Layoffs, consolidations, difficult decisions, and she'd made her peace with that by telling herself that the company's survival was what mattered, that the greater good required difficult choices, that her job was to execute strategy, not to carry the weight of individual stories. What Catherine did not have was time, and she'd made peace with that trade-off so thoroughly, so completely, that she'd stopped noticing it was a trade at all. She'd stopped noticing that she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a meal that wasn't eaten at her desk or in a car or standing up while doing something else. She'd stopped noticing that her apartment, which cost more per month than most people's mortgage, felt like a hotel, expensive, clean, utterly impersonal. She'd stopped noticing that the relationships in her life had become transactional. The men she occasionally dated were other ambitious professionals, and their interactions had the quality of 2 busy executives scheduling time together, efficient, cordial, completely hollow. She had colleagues, but no friends. She had a family, a mother in Connecticut who'd been thrilled when Catherine became VP and who Catherine called once a month, always from her car between meetings. But she had no family relationships, not really. She had accomplishments, but no peace. She had everything, but nothing that actually made her want to wake up in the morning. But something shifted on a Tuesday morning in October, and the shift was so small, so ordinary, that it took her weeks to understand that it had been the moment everything changed. She was sitting in a quarterly strategy meeting, the kind of meeting that happened every 90 days, where the leadership team reviewed metrics and performance and discussed the next phase of optimization. There were 14 people in the room, all of them vice presidents or above, all of them simultaneously talking and checking their phones, all of them moving through the meeting with the sense that this was obligation more than anything else. Her colleague David was presenting an initiative focused on workplace wellness. It was a low-priority initiative, something that human resources had pushed for, something that the company was implementing because they wanted to be seen as progressive, and because the research suggested that employee wellness programs reduce turnover slightly. David was presenting it with the kind of efficiency that meant he clearly didn't believe in it, didn't think it was important, and wanted to get through it as quickly as possible so they could move on to discussions about revenue optimization and market expansion. The initiative included several components: subsidized gym memberships, on-site meditation classes, mental health resources, flexible scheduling options that allowed employees to work from home 1 day a week. And as Catherine listened to David describe these components with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a tax code, she had a moment of sudden, unexpected clarity. She realized that she couldn't remember the last time she'd cooked a meal, not ordered it, not had it prepared by someone else, picked up on the way home, or eaten from a delivery service. Actually cooked it with her own hands, chopped vegetables, combined ingredients, used heat and time to transform raw elements into something nourishing. The memory didn't come back to her because it had been too long. It had retreated into the same category as things she'd done in childhood, things that belonged to a different version of herself, things that seemed oddly quaint and impossibly distant. She tried to think backward through her timeline, and the further back she went, the less she could pinpoint. Graduate school? She'd had a roommate who cooked, and Catherine had occasionally eaten the results. Undergraduate? She'd been on a meal plan. Before that, her mother had cooked, and Catherine had absorbed the vague knowledge that food preparation was something that happened, but she'd never paid attention to how, never asked, never learned. And in this moment, sitting in a meeting about workplace wellness, surrounded by 14 powerful people who were all also living lives devoid of the very things the wellness program was meant to address, Catherine understood something with devastating clarity. The problem wasn't that they needed better gym memberships. The problem was that they'd all abandoned the basic acts of living, of cooking, of eating slowly, of being present, in pursuit of the things that the meeting itself represented: power, recognition, advancement, money. She looked around the table at her peers. There was Richard, the CEO, who she knew was on his third marriage, who'd mentioned in a previous conversation that he hadn't seen his teenage daughter in 6 months because she was with her mother and he was traveling constantly. There was Margaret, the CFO, who'd mentioned during a one-on-one that her doctor had suggested she was close to having a heart attack, that she needed to reduce stress, but that there was no way she could do that given her role. There was James, the chief technology officer, who'd once confided that he'd started therapy because he didn't recognize himself anymore, that he felt like he was playing a character in his own life rather than actually living. And they were all sitting here, listening to HR's proposal for wellness initiatives, as though the solution to a life lived in crisis was a subsidized gym membership and 1 day a week working from home. Catherine felt something inside her break. She didn't say anything in the meeting. She didn't raise her hand and interrupt David's presentation to tell him that she'd just realized her life was a carefully constructed cage, and she'd been the one building the bars. She simply excused herself, said she had another meeting, which was a lie, and she left. She went back to her office and closed the door. She stood at the window, looking out at the city below. Millions of people, all of them living lives that presumably felt on some level like living. And she made a decision that felt small, but that would turn out to be everything. She was going to find out what a simple life felt like. Not in theory, not in aspiration, but in immediate, concrete practice. She was going to go to a grocery store and buy ingredients for a meal that she would cook herself. She was going to do this not because it was efficient or productive or aligned with any goal of her 5-year plan. She was going to do it because something inside her, something she'd managed to suppress for 18 years, was screaming that she'd forgotten how to be a human being. That afternoon, she left the office early. She didn't clear her calendar or make apologies or schedule a meeting with her assistant about what needed to happen in her absence. She simply closed her laptop, gathered her things, and walked out. In the parking garage, she sat in her car for 10 minutes. A car she'd purchased specifically because it was the kind of car that impressed certain people. A luxury sedan that felt like sitting in a piece of furniture rather than driving. And then she drove home. Her apartment was on the 34th floor of a building in the downtown core. It cost $4,800 per month. It had 3 bedrooms that were completely empty, a living room with minimalist furniture that no one actually sat on, A kitchen that had clearly been designed by someone who didn't cook and had never intended to, with pristine appliances that had rarely been used. The entire space felt like a set designed for a magazine spread about success. It felt like the apartment of a woman who was important and busy and had no time for something as pedestrian as actually living in her own home. Catherine walked through it and felt the strangeness of it, the way it reflected nothing about who she was or wanted to be. She went to her bedroom and opened her closet. It was organized by color and type. Business suits in charcoal, navy and black, blouses in white and cream, dresses for evening events, all of them expensive, all of them chosen because they communicated power or sophistication or the kind of success that could be read in thread count and designer labels. She looked at these clothes, at the armor she'd been wearing for 18 years, and she realized that she had no idea what she actually liked to wear. These were the clothes of Catherine Mercer, Vice President of Operations. They said nothing about Catherine, the person. She changed into jeans that were genuinely old, the kind she'd had for years, the kind that were soft and broken in, and that she wore when she wasn't being Catherine Mercer. She put on a sweater with a small hole in the cuff that she'd been meaning to throw away for 6 months. She found sneakers that were actually comfortable, the kind that didn't make her feet hurt after 8 hours. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman looking back at her was softer, younger, less impressive. She looked like a person who had time to think about things. That was exactly the point. She grabbed a tote bag from her closet, a simple canvas bag with no logo, no status signifier, and she went to her car. She drove to a neighborhood she didn't live in, on the other side of the city, where she'd never been before. She drove until she found a grocery store with a handwritten sign that said Martinez Family Market, and a window display that suggested the store was run by people who actually cared about food rather than people who saw it as an inventory management problem. The moment Catherine walked through the door of Martinez Family Market, she felt something shift. The store smelled like cilantro and fresh tortillas and cumin and something earthy that she couldn't name, but that felt like home in a way her actual apartment never had. The aisles were narrower than the supermarkets she'd been to, packed efficiently but not aggressively. The lighting was warm. There were handwritten signs taped to the shelves with prices written in careful cursive by someone who'd taken care with the letters. There was a produce section near the front with fruits and vegetables arranged in wooden crates, and an older woman, probably in her 70s, was carefully arranging avocados, checking each one before she placed it, considering the composition the way an artist might. Catherine felt tears come to her eyes, and she didn't understand why until she realized that this place represented something she'd been missing: intention, care. The sense that the people working here actually thought about what they were doing rather than just executing a role. She picked up a small basket, even though she didn't have a specific list, and she began to wander. She moved through the produce section and picked items almost at random: a single bell pepper that felt substantial in her hand, a bundle of cilantro that smelled alive, a bag of rice, some onions that were papery and fragrant. She had no plan for any of these things. She'd never made a conscious choice about ingredients in her life. She was just moving through the store like a person who had nowhere to be, which, for the first time in 18 years, was actually true. She was standing in front of the tomato display, completely paralyzed by the choice between 2 different varieties, the ones that looked perfectly uniform and unblemished, and the ones that had slight imperfections that looked more real somehow, when a voice spoke behind her. "The ones on the left," the voice said. It was a man's voice, calm and certain but not presumptuous. "They'll last longer if you're taking them home, and they taste better if you're planning to cook with them rather than eat them raw." Catherine turned. The voice belonged to a man who was probably in his late 30s, possibly early 40s, with dark eyes and the kind of presence that made you think he was paying attention to something important, even though he was just helping a stranger choose tomatoes. He was wearing a work uniform, navy blue with a name patch that read Marcus, and there was something in his posture, in the way he was looking at her, that suggested he meant what he was saying. He wasn't just following a script for customer service, he was actually thinking about her question. "I don't actually know what I'm going to do with them," Catherine said. It was the truth, and it was a surprising thing to admit to a stranger. "That's okay," Marcus said, and he smiled in a way that suggested he genuinely meant it. Not in a condescending way, not in a way that suggested she was incompetent for not knowing, but in a way that suggested that not knowing was fine, that it was actually the beginning of something, not a failure. The question helps. Are you cooking for yourself or for someone else? It was such a simple question, but Catherine realized she had no idea how to answer it. She'd been cooking for neither for so long that the categories had become abstract. When she did prepare food, which was rarely, it was either for business meals where the food was irrelevant or background, something to consume while conducting business, or for herself alone, eaten quickly at her desk while she worked, eaten in a way that was purely functional, that extracted no pleasure from the experience. The idea of cooking, actually cooking, the kind where you paid attention to what you were doing, where you considered ingredients and timing and the way flavors might combine, had disappeared from her life so gradually that she couldn't pinpoint when it had happened. It had been a choice made incrementally, a series of small decisions that, when accumulated, had changed the fundamental texture of her existence. "For myself," she said finally, "I think I'm trying to remember how." Marcus nodded as though this made perfect sense, as though women came into his grocery store all the time saying they were trying to remember how to cook for themselves. Maybe they did. Maybe cooking was something that people did, something ordinary, and Catherine had just been out of the ordinary for so long that she'd forgotten. "In that case, take the ones on the left," Marcus said. He pointed to the slightly imperfect tomatoes. "Give them a few days on the counter before you use them. They'll ripen properly that way. You can't rush tomatoes. They ripen on their own timeline, and they're better if you let them." "You can't rush tomatoes," Catherine repeated. She was aware that she sounded slightly ridiculous, that she was repeating a sentence like it contained wisdom she'd been seeking, but she couldn't help it. It felt true. It felt like something she needed to hear. "No," Marcus said. "You really can't. My daughter learned that the hard way about 2 years ago. She wanted to grow tomatoes in our backyard for a school project. She was 8 years old, and she had this idea that if she gave them enough water and enough attention, she could make them grow on her schedule. She wanted them ready for a presentation by Tuesday, but tomatoes don't care about school projects or presentations. They're on their own timeline. Once she accepted that, and it took her a while, she was pretty frustrated at first. The whole thing became easier. She still grows them now. She's 10, and she's learned to appreciate them more because she knows what it takes to grow them properly." Catherine found herself asking him more questions. What did his daughter grow besides tomatoes? What else had she learned from gardening? How long had he been living in this neighborhood? The questions came from a place she'd thought was closed off, a place where curiosity lived, where she wanted to know things about people, not because it would benefit her professionally, but because the act of knowing was itself valuable. Marcus answered each question with the kind of attention that suggested there was nothing more important happening in this grocery store in his entire life than her curiosity. He didn't check his phone. He didn't seem impatient or like he had somewhere he needed to be. There was a quality to his presence that suggested he was fully where he was, fully engaged with the moment. Catherine had spent so long around people who were always somewhere else, checking emails, thinking about the next meeting, mentally moving forward to the next priority, that his presence felt almost shocking. When another customer came up and interrupted them to ask about the price of avocados, Marcus excused himself with genuine politeness, helped that person with the same attention he'd been giving Catherine, answered their questions, made a recommendation, and then turned back to Catherine as though no time had passed, as though the interruption hadn't displaced his focus. By the time Catherine left the grocery store, she had tomatoes on the left side of her bag, cilantro, onions, rice, and a recipe that Marcus had sketched out on the back of her receipt. It was a simple soup, nothing complicated. Soften the onions, add the tomatoes, add broth, let it simmer, finish with cilantro. It was a recipe that could be made in under an hour. It was also, she would later discover, the most important thing anyone had ever given her. She walked to her car with the bag of groceries, feeling the weight of them, an actual, physical weight, something real and substantial. She set them carefully on the passenger seat, and as she drove home, she kept thinking about what Marcus had said. You can't rush tomatoes. They ripen on their own timeline. She wondered if the same was true for people. That evening, Catherine did something she hadn't done in years. She turned off her phone. Not put it on silent, not put it in another room. Actually turned it off. She went to her pristine, unused kitchen and she began to prepare the soup. She took her time. She found a cutting board that she'd never actually used. She found a knife that was sharp. She looked at the onions for a moment, considering them, and then she began to cut. The knife moved through the onion's layers and the scent released. Pungent, alive, immediate. She continued cutting, watching the pieces accumulate on the cutting board, feeling the repetition of the motion, the way her hands had somehow remembered this task, even though her mind had not. She heated oil in a pot she'd bought because it was beautiful, not because she'd actually needed it, and when the oil was shimmering, she added the onions. The sound was immediate, the sizzle of raw onion meeting heat. She stirred them, and the kitchen filled with the smell of cooking onions, a smell that suddenly felt familiar, like it was connected to memories from her childhood, her mother's kitchen, times when her life had been simpler and smaller, and actually hers. She waited for the onions to soften, stirring occasionally, and as she waited she felt something happening inside her, a kind of quieting. Her mind, which was usually producing a constant stream of thoughts about work, about her schedule, about metrics and performance and the things she needed to accomplish, became quieter. Her attention contracted from the vast landscape of her responsibilities to the small, immediate universe of the soup she was making. She added the tomatoes, watching them break down in the heat, their skins beginning to separate, the seeds and juice releasing into the pot. She added the broth and adjusted the heat and let it simmer. The recipe said 20 minutes. Catherine set a timer, and then she did something she hadn't done in years. She sat down with nothing to do and waited. She sat at her dining table, the expensive table that usually had nothing on it but her laptop, and she watched the steam rise from the kitchen, and she let herself feel the strange, unfamiliar sensation of doing nothing. Not meditating, not engaged in some kind of wellness activity that was supposed to optimize her performance, just sitting, just being, just waiting for soup to cook. When the timer went off, she added the cilantro at the end, the way Marcus had suggested. The fresh herbs turned the soup a brighter green, and the aroma shifted, becoming more complex, more alive. She poured it into a bowl, a good bowl, one that she'd never actually used, and she sat at her table and she ate the soup slowly, tasting it, noticing the way the flavors combined, the way the simple ingredients had transformed into something more than the sum of their parts. It was the best meal she'd eaten in 18 years. After she finished, Catherine sat with the empty bowl for a long time. She thought about Marcus, about the way he'd helped her choose tomatoes, about the casualness of his kindness. She thought about his daughter, who was learning to grow things. She thought about the life she'd been living, and the life she'd just touched the edge of, and the vast distance between them. That night, she slept better than she had in months, and when she woke up the next morning, the first thing she thought about was returning to Martinez Family Market. Over the next few weeks, Catherine found reasons to return to the grocery store. Tuesday became Wednesday, became Thursday. She told herself she was going back for other ingredients, for vegetables to continue the experiment of cooking for herself, for other lessons in the simple art of feeding herself well. But she knew the truth, and the truth was that she wanted to talk to Marcus again. She wanted to stand in his presence, which had become, she realized, the only place where she felt like a real person. She learned the patterns of his schedule. He worked there 2 evenings a week after his main job, which he'd mentioned was in the maintenance department of a tech company. Those nights, his presence in the store was noticeable, not because he was flashy or loud or tried to draw attention to himself, but because he genuinely saw the people who came through the store. He remembered what customers had asked him about on previous visits. He followed up. An older woman came in looking for a specific type of flour for a recipe she was making, and Marcus didn't just point her to the aisle. He walked with her, asked about what she was baking, and when she mentioned that she was making the recipe for her granddaughter's birthday, he suggested additions and variations that might make it even better. A young man came in with a list, written in shaky handwriting, looking confused and overwhelmed by the task of finding ingredients, and Marcus helped him locate everything, moving at whatever pace the man needed, never making him feel rushed or incompetent. A teenager came in, looking tired and stressed, and Marcus asked him about school, about what was overwhelming him. And when the kid mentioned that he had an exam coming up, Marcus started talking about how he'd learned to study differently, how breaking tasks into smaller pieces made them feel manageable, how it helped to take breaks and remember that learning was a process, not a race. Catherine watched all of this. She watched how Marcus moved through his small, contained world with more intentionality than she'd ever moved through her vast, impressive one. She watched how people responded to him, not with the kind of deference she was used to, not with the careful politeness people showed to people with power, but with genuine warmth. They trusted him. They talked to him. They asked him for advice, not because he had a title or credentials that qualified him, but because something in the way he listened suggested he cared about the answer. She realized that she had never in her entire career been trusted in that way. People respected her, people deferred to her, people wanted things from her, but they didn't trust her because trust requires a kind of vulnerability, and she'd built her entire identity around the idea that vulnerability was weakness. One evening after closing time, a closing time that Catherine had learned by asking a cashier when Marcus would next be working, she approached him as he was putting away a produce display. The store was quiet. The older woman who arranged the avocados had left hours before. The other employees had gone home. There was just Marcus restocking apples from a crate, moving with the same care and attention he gave to everything. "I've been making that soup every week," Catherine said. Her voice sounded strange in the quiet store, almost intrusive. Marcus turned, and his face lit up in a way that made Catherine feel seen in a manner she'd never felt before. Not impressive or accomplished, but seen, like he was recognizing her, truly recognizing her, not the role she played, but the person underneath. "The tomato one?" he asked. "Yes. I've been experimenting with it, adding different herbs, trying to understand how the flavors work together, how different things change when they come together." "That's how you learn," Marcus said. He set down the apples he was holding and gave her his full attention. "You have to taste them, understand them individually, and then see how they change when they come together. See what they become when they're combined with other things. That's when the real complexity emerges." They talked for an hour after that. The store was closed. The lights were on only because they were still working, and Marcus didn't seem to mind. He seemed happy, actually, to have this time, to have this conversation. Marcus told her about his kids. His son, David, was 10 years old and had recently become obsessed with coding, which Marcus said was something he didn't quite understand, but that he was learning about so he could talk to his son about it. His daughter Sophie was 7 and still growing tomatoes, and she'd started a small garden in their backyard with other plants. basil, mint, some flowers. Sophie was learning, he said, that gardens required patience and attention and that you couldn't force things to grow on your timeline. He told her about their mother, who'd left when Sophie was a baby, about the years he'd spent working multiple jobs, maintenance by day, stocking at the grocery store by evening, while trying to be present for his kids, while trying to make sure that his work didn't mean he missed the things that mattered. He told her about the way he'd eventually found a rhythm that worked, a way of living that allowed him to provide for his kids without sacrificing the time with them that he knew was irreplaceable. He talked about his main job, doing maintenance at a tech company. He mentioned the company name, and Catherine felt her chest tighten slightly, though she didn't let him see it. He didn't mention his job as a complaint. He didn't frame it as a limitation or a failure or a stepping stone to something better. He presented it as a fact of his life that he'd integrated into a larger whole that included his kids, his community, his integrity, his commitment to being a present father. He seemed genuinely content with his life, and that contentment was so alien to Catherine's experience that she found herself studying him, trying to understand how a person could be satisfied with what he had rather than always reaching for more. "What about you?" Marcus asked eventually. The question was gentle, genuine. "What do you do?" Catherine opened her mouth to answer with her title, her position, her credentials. It was automatic. It was how she always answered this question. Vice President of Operations at a tech company, Harvard MBA, 15 years in the industry, leadership of major initiatives. It was how she defined herself, the shorthand that explained who she was to people she met. But something stopped her. It felt dishonest somehow, like she would be collapsing herself into a single dimension, erasing all the complexity of what was actually happening in her life. Or perhaps it felt incomplete. The titles and credentials explained what she did, but they said nothing about who she was or wanted to be. "I work in operations," she said finally. "In tech, but I'm realizing that I don't actually know how to do anything else." "Like what?" Marcus asked. He was genuinely curious, not making small talk. "Like cook, like be present with another person without checking my email on my phone. Like remember what I care about. Like—" She paused, and something inside her that had been locked opened. "Like live. I don't know how to live. I know how to work, and I know how to be successful, and I know how to impress people. But actual living, actually being alive and noticing it, I don't know how to do that anymore." Marcus didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her that it would be fine, or that she should just slow down, or that balance was important, as though these were simple problems with simple solutions. He didn't try to fix her or rescue her, or suggest that what she needed was a wellness program or a vacation. Instead, he said something that would change her life. "That sounds like you already know what needs to change," he said. "That's the hard part. The rest is just remembering that you have the ability to do it. You know how to cook. You've done it before. Your hands remember. You just have to give yourself permission to do it slowly without the urgency. That's the part that's hard for people like you." "People like me?" Catherine asked. "People who are used to performing," Marcus said. "People who are used to knowing the answer before anyone asks the question. It's hard for people like that to just try something and fail and try again. But that's how you actually learn. That's how tomatoes teach you. They fail, they get overwatered, they don't grow properly, and then you adjust. You don't rush them. You don't make them fit your timeline. You adjust your timeline to theirs." That conversation happened on a Thursday evening. Catherine left the grocery store and drove home in a kind of daze, her mind moving in circles, her understanding of herself and her life shifting in real time. On Friday, Catherine did something that would have been unthinkable 2 months earlier. She went to her company's CEO, a man named Richard, whom she'd known for 15 years, with whom she'd attended countless meetings and strategy sessions, and who she'd been friendly with in the professional sense. And she told him that she was stepping back from her VP position, not leaving the company entirely, not abandoning her responsibilities, but moving to a consulting role where she worked 20 hours a week instead of 60. where she was present for strategic decisions but not responsible for the day-to-day execution, where she was paid less, significantly less, but where she also had the possibility of a life that existed outside the context of work. Richard's first response was shock. His second response was disappointment. He expressed concern about the company's ability to function with her reduced involvement, about the gap that her reduced hours would create, about the fact that she was stepping back at a crucial moment in the company's development. But he asked her why, and when Catherine tried to explain it, she realized she couldn't articulate it in the language of the corporate world. Productivity, efficiency, impact, return on investment. None of those words captured what she was trying to say, so she said something different. "I've been trying to win a game where winning means I lose everything that matters," she said. "And I finally noticed I was losing. I finally noticed that I've lost years. I've lost the ability to be present. I've lost my sense of what actually makes me happy. And I realized that no amount of success is worth that. So I'm choosing differently. I don't know if it's the right choice. I don't know what comes next. But I know that continuing on the path I've been on is definitely wrong." Richard didn't understand, but he let her do it. Maybe he was tired of his own life. Maybe seeing Catherine make this choice meant that he had to see his own choices more clearly, and he didn't want to think about that. Or maybe he simply had the humanity to recognize that sometimes people need to step back, and the company would survive without her running it at full speed. Within 2 weeks, Catherine had restructured her entire life. What happened next was the part that no one would have predicted, because Catherine didn't just step back from work. She stepped back into something else entirely, something that had no name in her previous life, something she'd abandoned so completely that she barely recognized it as a possibility. She started cooking, seriously. She spent a Saturday taking a class at a community center, learning basic knife skills and technique from a woman who seemed to take genuine pleasure in teaching people how to handle ingredients. She read books about food and nutrition and the philosophy of cooking, books that suggested that eating together was not just a biological necessity, but a form of presence, a way of being with other people that was different from any other interaction. She learned that cooking was a form of meditation, that the repetitive motions of chopping and stirring could quiet the mind in a way that meditation classes couldn't, because it was purposeful quieting, purposeful focus, purposeful presence. She started a small supper club in her apartment, nothing formal, nothing with an agenda or a hashtag or a social media presence. Just people she knew, invitations extended through simple conversation, colleagues from her new part-time consulting role, her mother, friends she'd neglected for years, people from her building. She would prepare a meal, usually something simple but made with care, and she would invite them over to eat it together, to sit at her table without the weight of professional performance, without the urgency of multitasking. And somehow, nearly every week, Marcus found his way to those dinners, not as a guest in the formal sense. Catherine would invite him directly, would ask him to come, would express genuine desire for his presence. He would arrive sometimes with Sophie, sometimes with David, sometimes alone. Catherine discovered that she was happiest not when she was impressing people with her credentials or her cleverness, but when she was watching a 7-year-old girl take a second helping of pasta because it was good, because it was made with care, because someone had thought about her and her preferences while making it. Her mother came to the dinners and watched this transformation with something like awe. She told Catherine that she'd never seen her daughter so happy, so present, so genuinely alive. Her mother told her that the apartment finally felt like a home, like a place where someone actually lived rather than a showroom for expensive furniture. Her mother, who was 72 years old and had spent decades being the wife and mother and hostess rather than ever asking herself what she wanted, watched her daughter learning to live differently and said, "I wish I'd done this 30 years ago." Catherine's colleagues, the ones who attended the suppers, seemed surprised by this version of her. They would arrive in their business casual clothes, their minds still partly at work, and over the course of the evening, something would happen. They would set their phones down. They would actually taste the food. They would have conversations that weren't about work or status or advancement. By the end of the evening, several of them would ask Catherine if they could come back. And through all of this, Marcus remained steady. He came to the dinners, and he moved through them with the same presence he brought to the grocery store, talking to people, asking questions, genuinely interested in the lives of the people in Catherine's apartment. He didn't seem impressed by the people she knew, or the context of the apartment, or any of the markers of her previous life. He seemed only interested in who they were, in what they cared about, in what made them come alive. Catherine's feelings for Marcus deepened in a way that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't love exactly, though it contained elements of love. It was something deeper, something that had to do with recognition, with the fact that he saw her in a way that felt true, that felt like it accounted for all the parts of her, the ambition and the insecurity and the capacity for care and the fear that she was doing everything wrong. 6 months after that first conversation in the grocery store, after the suppers had become a regular thing, after Catherine had learned to live differently and was actually happy in a way she'd never been before, Marcus arrived early to one of the dinners. He looked different than usual, more nervous, more like he had something to say. They sat in Catherine's living room, the living room that finally felt like a place where someone lived, with worn furniture and books and evidence of actual human experience. And Marcus told her something he'd never mentioned before. He told her that the tech company where he worked maintenance was the same company where Catherine was a VP. He told her that he'd known who she was that day in the grocery store. Not from her clothes or her appearance. She'd been genuinely unrecognizable, dressed down in a way that had removed all the external markers of her position, but from the way the other maintenance workers talked about her. She was the executive who pushed for change, they'd said. She was someone who asked questions that made people uncomfortable, who seemed to care about something deeper than the bottom line, something that most executives didn't care about. She was known in the maintenance department as someone who at least seemed like she was paying attention to something real. "I knew you were important," Marcus said. "I also knew you looked lost." Catherine felt something break open inside her chest. She'd been feeling vulnerable with him for months, but this was different. This was the vulnerability of being seen, of having her public and private selves recognized, of having someone know who she was in her professional context and her personal context, and not separate them into different versions. "Why did you help me?" she asked, "if you knew who I was?" "Because you asked for help," Marcus said. "And because you were willing to admit you didn't know how to pick a tomato." That kind of honesty is rare in people with power. Most people would have pretended they knew. They would have made a choice confidently, even if they had no idea if it was the right choice. But you asked. You admitted you didn't know. That takes a kind of courage that most of the executives I see don't have. Catherine wanted to say something, but Marcus continued. His voice was different now, more serious, and she could feel that he was leading to something important. "I've been offered a promotion," Marcus said, "at the company. Someone in upper management noticed my work. They noticed the way I do things, the care I take, the way I think about problems. They noticed that people trust me, that I listen, that I follow through. And they want to move me into a supervisory position in facilities management. It's a significant promotion. The salary would double, the benefits would change, my kids would have opportunities that they don't have now." Catherine felt joy for him, genuine joy. He deserved this. He deserved recognition. He deserved the resources that would make his life easier. But then Marcus said something that stopped her. "I turned it down," he said. Catherine's first response was shock, then confusion. Then, as understanding began to arrive, something else. "Why?" she asked, even though she thought she knew. "Because I've been watching what advancement looks like in that company," Marcus said. "I've been watching the executives, including you, when you were in your full VP role. I watched what happened to you. I watched you disappear into your own life, and I saw that the promotion they're offering me would require significantly more hours. It would require me to move into a different kind of work. Management, strategy, the things that consume all your time and energy. It would change the time I have with my kids. And I thought about it, and I realized something. He paused, and Catherine waited, knowing that what he was about to say was important. I have enough, Marcus said. I have a roof, I have food, I have my children's presence, which is the thing that actually matters. That's not a problem to solve with more money. That's a full life. The promotion they offered wouldn't improve my life. It would diminish it. So I said no. Catherine understood then, with sudden and complete clarity, what had actually happened. She hadn't transformed Marcus. She hadn't saved him, or changed him, or offered him any kind of redemption. The opposite had occurred. Marcus had recognized her not with judgment, but with the kind of clarity that only comes from already knowing what a full life actually looks like. He had seen her struggling towards something he'd already learned, and he'd offered her guidance not because she was superior or impressive, but because she was human, and she was lost, and he had already found what she was looking for. The gratitude she felt in that moment was almost unbearable. It was gratitude that moved through her entire body, that made her want to cry, that made her want to kneel in front of him and thank him for seeing her, for not letting her believe that the armor she was wearing was protection, for showing her that visibility isn't the same as being seen, that recognition isn't the same as being known. Thank you, she said, and it meant something she'd never meant with those words before. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for helping me understand that I was lost. Thank you for showing me what a full life actually looks like. Thank you for refusing to be promoted so that I could understand what matters. Marcus smiled. You did the work, he said. I just picked the right tomatoes. What Catherine learned in the months that followed was that transformation isn't a promotion. It isn't an achievement. It isn't something that happens to you or is given to you or that you can accomplish through effort and strategy. Transformation is what occurs when you finally stop running towards something external and instead turn to face what's actually in front of you. It's what happens when you realize that the person you thought was missing pieces has actually been living the whole time, and you've been the one running empty, trying to fill a void that no amount of success can actually fill. She never went back to her VP position. She consulted for another year, gradually reducing her hours further until eventually she stepped back from that too. She sold her expensive apartment and bought a smaller home in the neighborhood where Marcus worked, in a neighborhood she'd come to love, where she knew people by name, where she'd become part of a community rather than being a stranger in a building full of strangers. She started a non-profit focused on teaching cooking and food systems to kids in underserved communities, work that had no title that would impress people at dinner parties, no business cards to hand out, no credentials or recognition, but work that gave her something her VP position never had, work that gave her the feeling that her presence mattered, that her hands and her attention and her time actually made a difference in people's lives in ways that she could see and touch and understand. Her mother got involved in the non-profit. She learned to cook with intention. She started volunteering. She told Catherine that watching her daughter live this way had given her permission to imagine a different kind of life for herself. Even at 72, she started taking pottery classes. She made friends. She began to actually live rather than just exist. Her colleagues, the ones who'd come to the suppers, started their own version of what Catherine had created. They formed their own supper clubs. They started cooking. They carved out time. Some of them left their jobs. Some of them restructured their roles. All of them reported the same thing, that the moment they stopped treating living as something they would do once they were successful enough, once they had accomplished enough, once they'd achieved enough, everything changed. And Marcus stayed at the grocery store. He stayed in his maintenance job. He continued his small, dignified life. He continued to grow tomatoes with Sophie. He continued to learn to code with David. He continued to be present with his children in a way that most fathers, especially fathers in positions of greater power and resources, never managed to be. Catherine became part of his life in a way that felt natural and right. Not as someone who'd rescued him or been rescued by him, but as someone who'd learned to slow down enough to notice what grace actually looks like when it's standing right in front of you, restocking apples in a neighborhood grocery store, asking customers about their families, genuinely caring about what they're going to cook for dinner. The real turnaround isn't that Catherine achieved something remarkable, it's that she finally stopped trying. It isn't that Marcus was recognized by someone with power. It's that he was already living the life that power spends its entire career chasing. When she finally noticed, everything changed for her. And that's the thing about people like Marcus, about invisible people with genuine character. Their transformation of others doesn't happen through action. It doesn't happen through doing anything or changing anything or implementing anything. Their transformation of others happens through the simple fact of their existence. They show us what we've been missing by just being exactly who they are, with all the integrity and presence and care that comes from understanding what actually matters. Catherine thinks about this sometimes, usually while she's cooking. She thinks about the moment in the grocery store when she didn't know how to pick a tomato, and she asked for help from a stranger. And that moment opened a door to an entire different kind of life. She thinks about the fact that the life she'd built with such care and effort and sacrifice was actually a prison, and the life she's living now, the one she walked into almost by accident, is actually freedom. She thinks about the millions of people out there who are still in the prison she used to live in, people who are trading their lives for titles that don't actually mean anything. People who are running towards something that they think will make them happy, without noticing that happiness is something that requires presence, and presence is something you can't achieve by running. She wants to tell them what she learned. She wants to say, stop running, slow down, notice what's in front of you. Ask for help when you don't know. The people who seem to have nothing often have everything, and the people who seem to have everything are often starving. Is there someone in your life who's been showing you something you weren't ready to see? Have you ever realized that the person you thought was lost was actually the one who was already home? Do you know what a full life actually feels like, or are you still running toward it, thinking that once you achieve the next thing, once you reach the next goal, then you'll finally be able to live? Tell me. If you're watching from São Paulo or São Luís or São Gonçalo, comment and tell me where you're watching from. Are you a single parent? Are you struggling with the question of how to be present with your children while also providing for them? Tell me your story. Tell me your city. Have you ever met someone whose character changed your entire understanding of what success actually means? Have you ever realized that the person who seemed to have the least actually had the most? Comment below. Know a single dad or parent with a story like this, someone whose presence transformed the people around them, someone who refused the promotion because they understood that advancement isn't the same as improvement. Send it to us. Include their city. We're looking for stories about people whose character is their superpower, whose integrity is what people remember about them. Single parents in Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Spain, across Latin America. Where are you watching from? Tell us your city, and tell us if you've experienced a moment where everything shifted because you finally stopped performing and started being present. Tell me about the moment you realized that you'd been running the wrong direction. Have you ever done something good without any recognition? Have you ever sacrificed invisibly for the people you love and never told anyone and didn't expect anything in return? Comment below. Catherine's entire life changed the moment she admitted she didn't know how to pick a tomato, the moment she allowed herself to be vulnerable with a stranger. What's the moment where you admitted you were lost? What's the most invisible thing you've sacrificed? Tell me in the comments. What's the thing you gave up that no one knows about? What's the thing you did for someone you love that you never told anyone? Have you ever seen character matter more than circumstances? Have you ever watched someone with nothing be more magnetic than someone with everything? Have you ever realized that the markers of success, the title, the salary, the apartment, don't actually mean anything if you're not alive to enjoy them? Tell me your story.